Good afternoon, y'all, and thank y'all for joining us for this latest section, session 14 of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Very happy y'all could be here with me today. As always, if you're here in the live Discord, thank you for being here. And you can find the pins in the pin section, the PDF that we're using. There's actually two for y'all to choose from in there now. And of course, if you're following along on the YouTube, thank you for that as well. And you can follow along with the same link that'll be in the description for y'all. Uh, we're going to be continuing chapter 5, which is the colonial administration as economic exploiter section, which in the Abhili PDF is section D of chapter 5. So that's the colonial administration as economic exploiter section of chapter 5. Uh, without further ado, let's get started. In addition to private companies, the colonial state also engaged directly in the economic exploitation and impoverishment of Africa. The equivalent of the colonial office in each colonizing country worked hand in hand with their governors in Africa to carry out a number of functions, the principal ones being as follows: to protect national interests against competition from other capitalists, to arbitrate the conflicts between their own capitalists, to guarantee optimal conditions under which private companies could exploit Africans. The last mentioned objective was the most crucial. That is why colonial governments were repeatedly speaking about the maintenance of law and order, by which they meant the maintenance of condition most favorable to the expansion of capitalism and the plunder of Africa. This led the colonial governments to oppose taxes. One of the main purposes of the colonial taxation system was to provide requisite funds for administering the colony as a field of exploitation. European colonizers ensured that Africans paid for the upkeep of the governors and police who oppressed them and served as watchdogs for private capitalists. Indeed, taxes and custom duties were levied in the 19th century with the aim of allowing the colonial powers to recover the cost of the armed forces which they dispatched to conquer Africa. In effect, therefore, the colonial governments never put a penny into the colonies. All expenses were met by exploiting the labor and natural resources of the continent. And for all practical purposes, the expense of maintaining the colonial government machinery was a form of alienation of the products of African labor. The French colonies were especially victimized in this respect, particularly since 1921. The revenue raised from taxation had to meet all expenses as well as to build up a reserve. Having set up the police, army, civil service, and judiciary on African soil, the colonizing powers were then in a position to intervene much more directly in the economic life of the people than had been the case previously. One major problem in Africa from a capitalist viewpoint was how to induce Africans to become laborers or cash crop farmers. In some areas, such as West Africa, Africans have become so attached to European manufacturers during the early period of trade on their own initiative, they were prepared to go to great lengths to participate in the colonial money economy. But that was not the universal response. In many instances, Africans did not consider the monetary incentives great enough to justify changing their way of life so as to become laborers or cash crop farmers. In such cases, the colonial state intervened to use law, taxation, and outright force to make Africans pursue a life favorable to capitalist profits. When colonial governments seized African lands, they achieved two things simultaneously. They satisfied their own citizens who wanted mining concessions or farming land, and they created the conditions whereby landless Africans had to work not just to pay taxes, but also to survive. In settler areas such as Kenya and Rhodesia, the colonial government also prevented Africans from growing cash crops so that their labor would be available directly for the whites. One of the Kenyan white settlers, Colonel Grogan, put it bluntly when he said of the Kikuyu, "We have stolen his land. Now we must steal his limbs." Compulsory labor is the corollary of our occupation of the country. In those parts of the continent where land was still in African hands, colonial governments forced Africans to produce cash crops no matter how low the prices were. The favorite technique was taxation. Money taxes were introduced on numerous items: cattle, land, houses, and the people themselves. Money to pay taxes was got by growing cash crops or working on European farms in their mines. An interesting example of what colonialism was all about, about was provided in French Equatorial Africa, where French officials banned the Manja people, now in Congo Brazzaville, from hunting, so that they would engage solely in cotton cultivation. The French enforced the ban, although there was little livestock in the area, and hunting was the main source of meat in the people's diet. Finally, when all else failed, colonial powers resorted widely to the physical coercion of labor, backed up, of course, by legal sanctions, since anything which the colonial government chose to do was legal. The laws and bylaws which peasants in British East Africa were required to maintain minimum acreages of cash crops like cotton and groundnuts were, in effect, forms of coercion by the colonial state. Although they are not normally considered under the heading of quote-unquote forced labor. The simplest form of forced labor was that which colonial governments exacted to carry out public works. Labor for a given number of days per year had to be given free for these public works, building castles for governors, prisons for Africans, barracks for troops, and bungalows for colonial officials. A great deal of this forced labor went into the construction of roads, railways, and ports to provide the infrastructure for private capitalist investment and to facilitate the export of cash crops. Taking only one example from the British colony of Sierra Leone, one finds that the railway, which started at the end of the 19th century, required forced labor from thousands of peasants, driven from the villages. The hard work and appalling conditions led to the death of a large number of those engaged in work on the railway. In the British territories, this kind of forced labor, including juvenile labor, was widespread enough to call forth in 1923 a native authority ordinance restricting the use of compulsory labor for Porterich Railway and road building. More often than not, means were found of circumventing this legislation. The International Forced Labor Convention was signed by all colonial powers in 1930, but again, it was flouted in practice. The French government had a cunning way of getting free labor by first demanding that African males should enlist as French soldiers and then using them as unpaid laborers. This and other forced labor legislation known as prestation was extensively applied in vast areas of French Sudan and French Equatorial Africa because cash crops are not well established in those areas. The main method of extracting surplus was by taking the population and making it work in plantation or cash crop regions nearer the coast. Present day, Upper Volta, Chad, and Congo Brazzaville were huge suppliers of forced labor under colonialism. The French got Africans to start building the Brazzaville to Point Nord Railway in 1921, and it was not completed until 1933. Every year of its construction, some 10,000 people were driven to the site, sometimes from more than 1,000 kilometers away. At least 25% of the labor force died annually from starvation and disease, the worst period being from 1922 to 1929. And Zoe says, and now we've arrived at the introduction of the policies Fanon was talking about in Rest of the Earth. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking about. Quite apart from the fact that the public works were of direct value to the capitalists, the colonial government also aided private capitalists by providing them with labor recruited by force. This was particularly true in the early years of colonialism, but continued in varying degrees up to the Second World War and even to the end of colonialism in some places. In British territories, the practice was revived during the economic depression between 1929 and 1933 during the subsequent war. In Kenya and Tanganyika, forced labor was reintroduced to keep settler plantations functioning during the war. In Nigeria, it was the 10 companies which benefited from the forced labor legislation, allowing them to get away with paying workers $5D per day plus rations. What's that? You'll tell me in a second. For most of the colonial period, the French government performed the same kind of service for the big timber companies who had great concessions of territory in Gabon and Ivory Coast. 5 pence per day plus rations. My goodness, 5 pence per day plus rations. The Portuguese and Belgian colonial regimes were the most brazen and directly rounding up Africans to go and work for private capitalists under conditions equivalent to slavery. In Congo, brutal and extensive forced labor started under King Leopold in the last century. Fuck King Leopold. So many Congolese were killed and maimed by Leopold's officials and police that this earned European disapproval even in the midst of the general pattern of colonial outrages. When Leopold handed over the Belgian government in 1908, he had made a huge fortune. Belgian and the Belgian government hardly relaxed the intensity of exploitation in Congo. The Portuguese have the worst record of engaging in slavery-like practices, and they too have been repeatedly condemned by the international public opinion. One peculiar characteristic of Portuguese colonialism was the provision of forced labor, not only for its own citizens, but also for capitalists outside the boundaries of the colonies. Angolans and Mozambicans were exported to the South Africans' mines to work for subsistence, while the capitalists in South Africa paid the Portuguese government a certain sum for each laborer supplied. The export of Africans to South Africa is still continuing. In the above example, the Portuguese colonialists were cooperating with capitalists of other nationalities to maximize the exploitation of African labor. Throughout the colonial period, there were instances of such cooperation, as well as competition between metropolitan powers. Generally speaking, a European power was expected to intervene when the profits of its national bourgeoisie were threatened by the activities of other nations. After all, the whole purpose of establishing colonial governments in Africa was to provide protection to national monopoly economic interests. Thus, the Belgian government legislated to ensure that freight to and from the Congo would be mainly carried by Belgian shipping lines, and the French government placed high taxes on groundnuts brought into France by foreign ships, which was another way of ensuring that groundnuts from French Africa would be exported in French ships. In a sense, this meant that Africans were losing their surplus through one straw rather than another, but it also meant that the total sum of exploitation was also greater. Because if competition among Europeans were allowed, it would have brought down the cost of services and raised the price paid for agricultural products. Africans suffered most from exclusive trade with the mother country in cases where the mother country was backward. African peasants in Portuguese colonies got lower prices for their crops and paid more for imported items. Yet Britain, the biggest of the colonialists in Africa, was also faced with competition from the more vigorous capitalists in Germany, the USA, and Japan. British merchants and industrialists lobbied their government to erect barriers against competition. For example, Japanese cloth exports to British East Africa rose from 25 million yards in 1927 to 63 million yards in 1933. And this led Walter Runciman, president of the British Board of Trade, to get Parliament to impose heavy tariffs on Japanese goods entering British colonies in Africa. This meant that Africans had to pay higher prices for a staple import, since British cloth was more expensive. From the viewpoint of the African peasant, that amounted to further alienation of the fruits of his labor. You know, reading through this, you can really start to put together the theme of Africans being separated from their natural resources and being charged exorbitant rates. Here he's talking about cloth. But I know in neo-colonialism, as we've talked about before, what was the one resource he was talking about? I think it was steel. It may have been, or some, and it was related to gun manufacturing and how that resource ends up being disproportionately expensive by the time these Europeans have taken it out the country, produced it into something, and then sold it back at way more than what it would ever be worth in a non-so-called market economy. So that's something interesting that this made me think about. So a perfect illustration of the identity of interest between the colonial governments and their bourgeois citizens was provided by the conduct of produce marketing boards in Africa. The origins of the boards go back to the Gold Coast cocoa holdup of 1937. For several months, cocoa farmers refused to sell their crop unless the price was raised. One apparently favorable result of the holdup was that the British government agreed to set up a marketing board to purchase cocoa from the peasants in place of the big business interests like the UAC and Cadbury, which had up until then been the buyers. A West African cocoa control board was set up in 1938, but the British government used this as a push to provide the private capitalists and to allow them to continue making their exorbitant profits. In theory, a marketing board was supposed to pay the peasant a reasonable price for his crop. The board set the crop overseas and kept the surplus for the improvement of agriculture and for paying the peasants a stable price if world market prices decline. In practice, the boards paid peasants a low fixed rate during many years when world prices were rising. None of the peasants went to Africans, but rather to the British government itself and to the private companies, which were used as intermediaries in the buying and selling of the produce. Big companies like the UAC and John Holt were given quotas to fulfill on behalf of the boards. As agents of the government, they were no longer exposed to direct attack, and their profits were secure. The idea of the marketing boards gained support from top British policymakers because the war came just at that time, and the British government was anxious to take steps to secure certain colonial products in the necessary quantities and at the right times, given a limited number of ships available for commercial purposes during war. They were also anxious to sell private capitalists who were adversely affected by events connected with the war. For example, East African sisal became of vital importance to Britain and her war allies after the Japanese cut off supplies of similar hard fibers from the Philippines and Dutch East Indies. Actually, even before fighting broke out, sisal was brought in bulk by the British government to help the non-African plantation owners in East Africa who had lost markets in Germany and other parts of Europe. Similarly, oilseeds such as palm produce and groundnuts were bought by a board from September 1939 in preparation for shortages of butters and marine oils. With regard to all peasant cash crops, the produce marketing boards made purchases at figures that were way below world market prices. For instance, the West African Produce Board paid Nigerians 16.15 pounds for a ton of palm oil in 1946 and sold that through the Ministry of Food for 95 pounds, which was nearer to the world market price. Ground nuts, which precede 15 pounds per ton, were bought by the boards, were sold in Britain at 110 per ton. Furthermore, export duties were levied on the board sales by the colonial administrators, and that was an indirect tax on the peasants. The situation reached a point where the many peasants tried to escape from under the boards. In Sierra Leone in 1952, the price for coffee was so low that growers smuggled their crop into the nearby French territories. At about the same time, Nigerian peasants were running away from palm oil into collection or timber felling, which did not come under the jurisdiction of the produce boards. If one accepts that the government is always the servant of a particular class, it is perfectly understandable that the colonial government should have been in collusion with capitalists to siphon off surplus from Africa to Europe. But even if one does not start from that Marxist premise, it would be impossible to ignore the evidence of how the colonial administrators worked as committees on behalf of the big capitalists. The governors in the colonies had to listen to the local representatives of the companies and to their principals. Indeed, there were company representatives who wielded influence in several colonies at the same time. Before the First World War, the single most important individual in the whole of British West Africa was Sir Alfred Jones, chairman of Elder Dempster Lines, chairman on the Bank of West Africa, president of the British Cotton Growing Association, and French West Africa in the late 1940s. The French governor showed himself very anxious to please one Marc Roucart, a man with major interest in several of the French trading companies. Such examples could be cited for each colony through its cities, although in some of them influence of the white settlers was greater than that of individual metropolitan businessmen. Company shareholders in Europe not only lobbied Parliament, but actually continued the administration itself. The chairman of the Cocoa Board within the Ministry of Food was none other than John Cadbury, a director of Cadbury Brothers, who were a participant in the buying pool, which exploited West African cocoa farmers. Former employers of Unilever held key positions in the oils and fat divisions of the Ministry of Food. They continued to receive checks from Unilever. The oil and fats division handled over the allocation of buying quotas for the produce boards to the Association of West African Merchants, which was dominated by Unilever's subsidiary, the UAC. It is no wonder that the Ministry of Food sent a prominent Lebanese businessman a directive that he had to sign an agreement drawn up by the UAC. It is no wonder that the companies had government aid in keeping prices down in Africa and securing forced labor where necessary. It is no wonder that Unilever then sold soap, margarine, etc. at profitable prices within a market assured by the British government. Of course, the metropolitan governments also ensured that a certain proportion of the colonial surplus went directly into the coffers of the state. They all had some form of direct investment in capitalist enterprises. The Belgian government was an investor in mining, and so too was the Portuguese government through its part ownership of the Angolan Diamond Company. The French government was always willing to associate itself with the financial sector. When colonial banks were in trouble, they could count on rescue from the French government, and indeed a proportion of the shares passed into the hands of the French government. The British colonial government was perhaps the least anxious to become directly involved in everyday business enterprises, but it did run the eastern Nigerian coal mines apart from railways. Marketing boards helped the colonizing power to get its hands on some immediate cash. One finds that the cocoa board sold to the British Ministry of Food at very low prices, and the ministry in turn sold to British manufacturers, making a profit that was as high as $11 million in some years. More important still, the board sold to the USA, which was the largest market and one where prices were very high. None of the profits went back to the African farmer, but instead represented British foreign exchange in American dollars. From 1943 to Britain and the USA engaged in what was known as reverse land-lease. This meant that wartime United States loans to Britain were repaid partly by raw materials shipped from British colonies to the USA. Tin and rubber from Malaya were very important in that context, while Africa supplied a wide range of products, both mineral and agricultural. Cocoa was third as a dollar earner after tin and rubber. In 1947, West African cocoa bought over $100 million, 38 million pounds, to the British dollar balance. Besides, having a virtual monopoly of the production of diamonds, South Africa was also able to sell to the USA and earn dollars in Britain. In 1946, Harry F. Oppenheimer told his fellow directors of the De Beers Consolidated Mines that sales of gem diamonds during the war secured about 300 million American dollars for Great Britain. It was on this very issue of currency that the colonial government did the most manipulation to ensure that Africa's wealth was stashed away in the coffers of the metropolitan state. In the British colonial sphere, coins and notes were first issued through private banks. And then this function was taken over by the West African Currency Board and the East African Currency Board, established in 1912 and 1919, respectively. The currency issued by those boards in the colonies had to be backed by sterling reserves, which was money earned by Africa. The manner in which the system worked was as follows. When a colony earned foreign exchange, mainly through exports, these earnings were held in Britain in pounds sterling. An equivalent amount of local East or West African currency was issued for circulation in the respective colonies, while the sterling was invested in British government stock, thereby earning even more profit for Britain. The commercial banks worked hard hand in hand with the metropolitan government and the currency boards to make the system work. Together, they established an intricate financial network which served the common end of enriching Europe at Africa's expense. The contribution to sterling reserves by any colony was a gift to the British Treasury, for which the colony received little interest. By the end of the 1950s, the sterling reserves of a small colony like Sierra Leone had reached 60 million pounds. While in 1955, the British government was holding 210 million derived from the sale of cocoa and minerals from Gold Coast. Egypt and the Sudan were also heavy contributors to Britain. Africa's total contributions to Britain, sterling balances in 1945 was 446 million pounds, which turned up to 1.4 trillion pounds by 1955, more than half the total gold and silver and dollar reserves of Britain and the Commonwealth, which then stood at 2.1 trillion. Men like Arthur Creech Jones and Oliver Littleton, major figures in British colonial policymaking, admitted that in the early 1950s, Britain was living on the dollar earnings of the colonies. The British government was outdone by its Belgian counterpart in exacting tributes from its colonies, especially during and after the last war. After Belgium was overrun by the Germans, a government in exile was set up in London. The colonial secretary of that exiled regime, Mr. Gotti, admitted that during the war, The Congo was able to finance all the expenditure of the Belgian government in London, including the diplomatic service as well as the cost of our armed forces in Europe and Africa, a total of some 40 million. In fact, thanks to the resources of the Congo, the Belgian government in London had not to borrow a shilling or a dollar, and the Belgian gold reserve could be left intact. Since the war, surplus of earnings by the Congo and currencies other than the Belgian franc have all accrued to the National Bank of Belgium. Therefore, quite apart from all that private capitalists looted from Congo, the Belgian government was also a direct beneficiary to the tune of millions of francs per annum. To discuss, French colonialism in this context would be largely to repeat remarks made with reference to the British and Belgians. Guinea was supposedly a poor colony, but in 1952, it earned France 1 billion old francs, or about $5.6 million in foreign exchange, based on the sale of bauxite, coffee, and bananas. French financial techniques were slightly different from other colonial powers. France tended to use the commercial banks more, rather than set up separate currency boards. France also squeezed more out of Africans by imposing levies for military purposes. The French government dressed Africans in French army uniforms and used them to fight other Africans, to fight other colonized peoples like the Vietnamese, and to fight in European wars. The colonial budgets had to bear the cost of sending these African French soldiers to die, but if they returned alive, they had to be paid pensions out of African funds. To sum up briefly, colonialism meant a great intensification of exploitation within Africa to a level much higher than that previously in existence under communalism or feudal-type African societies. Simultaneously, it meant the export of that surplus in massive proportions, for that was the central purpose of colonialism. Yeah, chapter 5 is a long one, so we'll continue with the next section next week, but we had a lot to discuss just from this section we just finished reading. So Zoe said, the export of capital that Lenin describes in Imperialism is purely for the purpose of establishing the fixed capital necessary to extract the resources and surplus value of the target colony, as we can see. I feel like he didn't write enough about the specific function of banking capital in all this, though. So what Rodney's talking about with currency manipulation is really important. Absolutely. And I want to learn more about this difference that he's talking about, too, when he says, like, French imperialist banking practices were, like, a little bit different, because he said they focused on, like, imposing levies and, like, doing commercial banking, as opposed to, what did he call it, let's see what word he used. He said they used some sort of board rather than just straight up commercial banking. What was it? Yeah, it was just here. We just got done reading that shit. Oh, I can't find it. But y'all heard what he said. Y'all can go back and listen. So he said that the French were basically like conscripting people into their military, and that through this conscription, they justified, what's the word I'm looking for? Imposing levies and fines and building up more infrastructure in the country, because they could just use the guise of like, oh, like we're responsible for training your military. Like these things are all like necessary. We're going to like help you build like stronger defense and all this nonsense. And then adding insult to injury by saying that if so-called French Africans came back from war alive, that what they had to be paid would come out of African money, not French. So the logic of imperialism is just clearly rearing its ugly head there. I saw you were typing, Rabuba. Did you have something that you wanted to add, comrade? Let's see. If not, it's all good. Let's see. One of the interesting things that he said in this chapter, the contribution of sterling reserves by any colony was a gift to the British Treasury, for which the colony received little interest. By the end of the 1950s, the sterling reserves of a small colony like Sierra Leone reached 60 million, while in 1955, the British government was holding 210 million. um, derived from the sale of cocoa and minerals from Gold Coast. Egypt and Sudan were also heavy contributors to Britain. Africa's total contributions to Britain's sterling balances in 1945 was 446 million, inflated up to 1.4 trillion, inflated up to 2.1 trillion eventually. So, like, when you combine that with like he was given figures earlier for just how little things were being bought by the colonizers and then sold back. He was naming figures as low as what was it up here? Yeah. So he said the West African Produce Board paid Nigerians 16.15 pounds for a ton of palm oil and then sold that through the Ministry of Food for 95. So they're in a very real material way, like, and you can start to see where like this hyper profit even originates from, because people are always, capitalists especially, like to ask like, well, or say like as if they're dunking on us Marxists, oh, well, profit doesn't just like pop up out of thin air, and they always mean that in this way that's like, oh, well, profit had to be struggled and like worked for. Yeah, that profit was worked for, but it wasn't by the person collecting the profit. It was by the people who produced the profit in the first place. These workers being paid significantly less than what it is they actually earn. I mean, he said 16.15 pounds was the rate that they were paying the people who were producing the fucking palm oil, only to go back and sell it for 16, 32, 48, 64, 80. 48, 64, 80, almost 6 times more than what they paid the actual laborers for. So it was just, this is where this profit is coming from. And we have to understand the exploitative nature of capitalism to understand that this is the logic of imperial economics everywhere that we see. What were some other examples that he was bringing up? I think that was the main one, though. The one with the palm oil. Zoe says Zach Cope does write some valid things about how this process of underpaying global South producers for their products works. So it's too bad he vulgarizes Marx really badly. Broken clock twice a day type shit, He said groundnuts, which workers got paid 15 pounds per ton for when bought by the boards, was sold at 110 per ton. So like the rate of like hyper exploitation is not even subtle. Like these are the kinds of things that they try to get you to not read, so that you don't really have to contextualize the just how bad workers are getting screwed, and you don't even have to like look if you're an American to the global South, to see how bad the exploitation is. I was just saying on Twitter the other day how bad it's been for my grandmother. My grandmother started out making the equivalent of, let's see, let me just make sure I don't get it wrong. So my grandmother started working in 1968, and she started off at $2.25. That would be $17.65 today. But yet she's still working at 73 years old in 2021 and only making about $10 an hour. So she's being significantly underpaid by these capitalists. And I mean, she's working in 17 or something. Exactly. It's $17.65. She is significantly underpaid. She works at Gabriel Brothers, a retail store. Those shirts there are going for $15, $20, stuff like that. $30 pairs of pants, that kind of shit. And like those pants, the fabric that goes into them, the shirts, none of that shit was anywhere near the cost that they're actually selling it for, So this shit is quite arbitrary from a certain point of view. And in a company like Gabe's standpoint, there isn't even any central planning that goes into how they decide to extort. It seems to me to just quite literally just be all vibes. In West Africa, cocoa, for example, bought over $100 million, 38 million to the British dollar balance. And besides having a virtual monopoly of the diamonds, South Africa also was able to sell to the USA and earn dollars in Britain. But it's like they're not even able to build up their own economies for having to like intermingle in the way that the logic of imperialism has caused them to have to intermingle, and like that ends up being a problem. Like when does this wealth being generated by all this exploitation get funneled back into Africa? And the answer, as Rodney is portraying it, quite literally ends up being never. And it said it was on this very issue of currency that the colonial government did the most manipulations to ensure that Africa's wealth was stashed away in the coffers of the metropolitan state. In the British colonial sphere, coins and notes were first issued through private banks. Then this function was taken over by the West African Currency Board and the East African Currency Board, established in 1912 and 1919. The currency issued by these boards in the colonies had to be backed by sterling reserved, which was money earned by Africa. The manner in which this system worked was as follows. When a colony earned foreign exchange, mainly through exports, these earnings were held in Britain in pound sterling. An equivalent amount of local East or West African currency was issued for circulation in the respective colonies, while the sterling was invested in British government stock, thereby earning more profit for Britain. The commercial banks worked hand in hand with the metropolitan government and the currency boards to make the system work. That's what I was looking for, the currency boards. Together, they established an intricate financial network which served the common end of enriching Europe at Africa's expense. You know, in layman's terms, they're quite literally funneling all the profit, both the resources and the material goods, and the currency being generated through all this exploitation back through Britain in pound sterling before it ever even gets to Africa. And this is the way that Britain is participating in leeching Africa. So we have to understand exactly what it looks like in material reality. Like, this isn't just exploitation, isn't philosophical. It's a quite literal material reality that's being laid out by Rodney here. So Zoe says, Marx writes in Poverty, a Philosophy, and in Capital about this exact phenomenon, how wages for workers can rise numerically, while real wages, what the workers can purchase with them, plummets dramatically. Exactly. You know, $10 is a bigger number for her, but it's not worth more than what that $2.65 was worth, and or $2.25 was worth when she started out in 1968. You know. Also, people poo-poo non-productive proletarian labor, like that of retail clerks, but they overlook the fact that these jobs are so important to the circulation of capital that the capitalists are willing to purchase them as services. That's a lot more significant to them than purchasing productive labor, which is no-brainer from their perspective. So it's still worth organizing in those sectors because that's where you keep the capitalists from being able to realize the values of their commodities. Oh, yeah. I mean, they're quite literally hoarding, like, those resources. Like, nothing is more of an example of the excess production model of capitalism than the existence of retail stores like Macy's and even smaller chain ones like Gabriel Brothers and shit like that. When you talk about, I mean, just go in there. You want to talk about overstocked shelves, overstocked products, you know, 60 or 70 pairs of the same goddamn jeans going for $40 a pop that ain't nobody fucking buying because a prole is perfectly fine wearing a $15 pair of jeans or a $10 pair of shorts with some $10 pair of sandals. You know, these people can afford to like take that loss and like on the hope that it turns into a profit. And like that's the entire context behind what resale exists on. I mean, for fuck's sake, you go to those stores and they quite literally throw it in your face that they're going to sell at a loss if it hasn't turned a profit with something like the clearance rack. What is a clearance rack other than a capitalist somewhere who decided to like take this item at a loss just to like unload it and at least make some of the money back? That's all what's the word I'm looking for? Clearance is. It's not some like generous deal being made for you by a capitalist. It's quite literally, this didn't sell. There was too much excess. We hoarded too much. We have to get rid of this commodity somehow. And if we have to take a loss to like unload it so we can bring in more merchandise that will sell, so be it. It's all a part of the calculus. All that shit they talk. So that's important shit. And just because people who work in non-productive labor sectors get called parasites, that doesn't mean they don't still have the same needs as other workers. Well, I mean, shit, I'll tell you what, my grandma definitely has. I mean, she's 73, so she has, you know, more dire needs than even some of these so-called productive workers, So, yeah, that's a good argument you're making there. So the wage demand can still be used there to organize the workers and cause pain to the capitalist. My grandmother said that every job that she's worked, they told the people not to talk about wages, which is super illegal. You can't tell people to not talk about wages. But I told her how they'll do it. Is what they'll do is they'll tell you that in private, and it's definitely phrased in the word of a demand. But uh, if you try to go public with it, they'll be like, "Oh no, I wasn't telling you what you could do. I was simply giving you a suggestion." I was giving you a suggestion, and like, because you like don't want to like disrupt the workplace and like make a worse working environment for yourself and all this shit. So they have all these like fucking weasel words that they try to use when people try to like organize around these conditions or even just have conversations about what the conditions are. So yeah, luckily for grandma, she got a radical grandson who would tell her that her material situation is fucking bullshit. To which grandma will of course clap back, yeah, it is, but grandma gotta eat and gotta work. So got to do what you got to do to survive, and that's quite literally the condition that all proletarians find themselves in. So, we're good. We finished that section of chapter 5. We're going to read. We're going to start next week with the strengthening of the technological and military aspects of capitalism, a preliminary examination of the non-monetary benefits of colonialism in Europe. That's section 2.2. Section A. And of course, we'll be continuing with the reading and getting back on track this week. So we'll continue with Michael Parenti's Inventing Reality on Saturday at 11 a.m. And going forward, that's going to be the only one we do. There's no need to hold more than one session. When the fall gets back and people are inside and this pandemic inevitably starts taking people back off the streets again, we might end up with more activity in here. So we'll rework it around that time. We'll continue with Angela Davis's Women Racing class tomorrow. And we'll be back to Nkrumah's Neo-colonialism next Monday, finally. So we got that to look forward to as well. Zoe says, of course, the problem with at-will employment is that it's not a violation of your rights for the employer to fire you for literally no reason. And it's better for them because if they give a reason, it might be one the worker can use to prove they've been discriminated against. Oh yeah, they can fire you for being racist. I mean, or to do is be smarter than other is. Like, I hate this fucking black person always sassing me, but as long as I don't say that, I can get rid of them and just write it off as like, yeah, this is just not a worker. I'm just making payroll cuts, shit like that. It's all kind of ugly ass racist logic that they have for being able to engage the way they engage. It's sick. So, anyways, comrades, love y'all. Solidarity always. And I will see you guys tomorrow for Women Racing class. Y'all take care.